What if what we call history was just the surface of something much older? Beneath the streets, beneath the cities that seem solid and definitive, there is an ancient silence waiting to be heard. A silence made of stone, of tunnels, of structures that do not demand attention but store memory. The Europe we learned about in school is young. The Europe that rests beneath it is something else. If you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is just the thing that you needed to hear right now. Breathe. Not as someone looking for quick answers, but like someone who allows themselves to remember. There are places where the soil is not just ground, it is archives. Layers upon layers of construction, destruction, and beginning again. Each stone sitting on another like a sentence written by hands that no longer have a name. And yet something in them remains alive. It's not ruin. It's a trace. It's no coincidence. It's standard. For centuries, we have been taught to look to Europe as the cradle of modern reason, of organized science, of linear progress. But rarely have we been invited to look at low, for what was buried when new narratives needed to be born, for what was forgotten when certain truths became too inconvenient to survive light. Under cathedrals, squares, and castles, there are corridors that do not appear on maps tourist, cities under cities, tunnels that connect eras, structures that are not easily fit into official schedules. And the deeper you dig, the less comfortable is the story we tell ourselves. This isn't just about archaeology. It's about human memory, about the ancient impulse of hide, protect, or seal that which cannot be destroyed. Civilizations do this all the time. They bury their fears. They bury their secrets, bury your own past when he threatens to rewrite who they believe themselves to be. Maybe that's why these structures worry us so much. They don't speak loudly. They don't explain. They just exist. And as they exist, they ask a silent question to each of them. Us. Who would you be if everything you were taught about origin, beginning, and evolution was incomplete? Along this path, we will not treat Europe as a continent, but as a mirror of the human soul which builds, forgets, erases, and even so, leaves tracks. What is hidden beneath Europe is not just beneath the earth, it's under the narrative, and perhaps beneath something inside you that is slowly beginning to awaken. Today, you are not a spectator, you are a witness. Every step of this journey is an invitation to look without haste, feel without fear, and question without guilt. Nothing here requires belief blind. Just pay attention, because when the earth keeps secrets for millennia, it doesn't wait curious. She waits for whoever is ready to hear what silence has always tried to say. And maybe in the end, you will discover that the story was never lost, just dormant, waiting for the exact moment to be remembered again. By those willing to come down consciously. Before empires, before crowns, even before the languages that today name mountains and rivers, Europe was already inhabited by something that does not easily fit into books. We are not just talking about ancient peoples, but about a human continuity that extends far beyond the comfortable line we call the beginning of civilization. The official history likes clear starting points, dates, frames, discoveries, but European soil insists in telling another story, fragmented, deep, and disconcerting. When archaeologists excavate certain regions of Europe, what they find is not always matches what they expected to find. Structures that seem too sophisticated for the period to which they are assigned. Precise alignments with astronomical events that they would require prolonged observation and refined mathematical knowledge. Constructions that appear as if they were chapters torn from an older book, forcibly glued onto a later narrative. Stonehenge is not alone. Dolmens, menhirs, stone circles, and buried cities spread across the entire continent. They do not appear in isolation, but as part of a network symbolic and technical that crosses modern borders. The inevitable question is not just how were they built, but who built them and why? Because when standards are repeated in distant places, chance begins to lose strength as an explanation. Prehistoric Europe is often portrayed as a territory of scattered tribes, fighting for survival, tied to rudimentary tools and an understanding limited in the world. But this image begins to crumble when we realize that many of these peoples dominated advanced agriculture, large-scale engineering, and a profound with the cycles of nature and the sky. They watched, they registered, they planned, and above all, they remembered. There is an almost invisible discomfort when this evidence comes to light. Why accept them requires admitting that human evolution was not a line, ascending straight line, but a sequence of peaks and falls. Civilizations that flourished, collapsed, and disappeared, taking with them knowledge that would only be rediscovered thousands of years later. This idea does not diminish the present. It makes you more humble. In several European regions, modern cities were built on very strong foundations. Older. Rome is the best-known example, but it is far from the only one. Paris, London, Prague, Istanbul. Beneath these pulsating cities lie entire layers of human occupation that rarely receive popular attention. Tunnels, walls, rooms, and passages that do not belong exactly to one era, but to several overlapping ones. And perhaps that's what bothers the most, because these layers don't tell a story clean. They tell an interrupted story of hastily carried out reconstructions after collapses, of reusing structures whose original purpose had already been forgotten, from people who inherited stones without inheriting their full meaning. When we talk about Europe before official history, we are not talking about a void waiting to be filled. We talk about excess, an excess of the past, an accumulation of human experiences so vast that it needed to be simplified to fit into timelines, national curricula, and identities. Something had to be left aside for a narrative to happen. Coherent could exist, but oblivion is never total. It infiltrates the myths, the legends, the tales popular, stories of ancient people, of golden ages, of lost knowledge, stories that adults learn to call fantasy, but which perhaps are just memories poorly translated by time, echoes of a past that has not disappeared, just changed shape. When looking at this ancient Europe, before the history we were taught, something begins to emerge, move within us, a strange feeling of recognition, as if these stones, these tunnels, and these ruins didn't just speak of who we were, but of something that still we are, because understanding that there were worlds before ours is accepting that ours too it is not definitive. And this perception, silent and profound, prepares the ground for an even more disturbing question. If these civilizations existed, where exactly are the best-kept traces of what they knew? There are structures that defy not only historical logic but common sense itself. Common. They remain motionless, silent, while time tries to explain them without success. Stones cut with millimeter precision. Colossal blocks adjusted without mortar. Perfect angles repeated as if a mathematical mind were recorded on the rock. When we look at these works, something inside us realizes that we are not faced with improvisation, but with intention. In Europe, these structures appear where you least expect them. On rural hills under ancient forests, incorporated into medieval walls as if they were simple stones reused. Megaliths erected with such precision that they still challenge modern engineers. Tunnels excavated in hard rock, maintaining alignment and ventilation after thousands of years. Nothing in this suggests primitive attempt. Everything suggests domain. There are places where blocks weighing tens of tons were transported over distances improbable and positioned with a precision that does not even allow the passage of a blade. The official explanation talks about ropes, logs, and human strength, but when tested, these hypotheses appear to be fragile, incomplete, almost symbolic. The engineering presented does not explain the observed result. Even more intriguing is the repetition of similar techniques in distant regions. The same type of fitting, the same obsession with solar or stellar alignment, the same choice for specific locations in the landscape. This indicates transmission of knowledge, continuity, cultural or technical heritage. Something was passed on. Something was learned, preserved, and rigorously applied. When modern science tries to reproduce these feats with simple tools, the result is revealing. The time required explodes. Material wear becomes absurd. The margin of error increases. Still, the ancient structures remain firm, aligned, resilient. It is no exaggeration to say that, in some aspects, they surpass the which we were able to do easily today. Perhaps the mistake is in assuming that these civilizations thought like us. What they sought speed, economy, and improvisation. And if, on the contrary, they worked with another notion of time, with projects designed to cross eras, not generations. Works done to last, not to impress momentarily. When time stops being enemy, engineering changes. There is also the uncomfortable possibility of forgotten technologies, not machines futuristic, but precise methods, now lost, that combined geological knowledge, acoustic and energetic, techniques that left no manuals, only results. The problem of a culture that falls is that it leaves no explanatory notes for the future. These are structures. Do not ask us to abandon science, but to expand it. What let us accept the possibility of real gaps in our historical understanding? Why deny the complexity of the past does not make it simpler, just more fragile? The engineering forgotten Europe does not threaten the present. It invites you to humility, and perhaps that is why these works cause so much discomfort. They whisper that there was intelligence before us, order before the chaos we imagine, method where we assumed superstition. They remind us that humanity has already been capable of extraordinary feats without consider superior. And this memory, silent and firm, prepares the ground for, let's go even deeper. It's not about glorifying a mythical past, but about recognizing real competence. When we accept that the past was complex, we open space for better questions. Who taught? Who learned? What was lost along the way? Every impossible structure is a materialized question. And questions, when ignored, don't go away. They wait. There is a curious feeling when, standing in front of these buildings, not fear, not admiration, simple. It's recognition, as if something very ancient within us understood before rational mind. The stone speaks in silence. Alignment communicates intention, and the body feels that there was awareness applied with care, patience, and far-reaching vision. These works have survived wars, extreme climates, and radical cultural changes. No by chance, but by design. They were designed to resist oblivion, and maybe have achieved. Because even fragmented, they continue to provoke questions, attracting looks and disconcerting certainties. The past, when well constructed, does not disappear. He insists. Denying this engineering is comfortable, because it preserves a simple narrative, but the excessive simplicity impoverishes. As we accept the complexity of the past, we enrich the present. We started to see Europe not as an absolute starting point, but as a territory of multiple inheritances, some of which have not yet been deciphered. And that changes everything, because when we realize that there were engineers before engineers, architects before books, and science before labels, something realigns internally. The past leaves of being inferior. He becomes a dialogue partner, and this is where curiosity wins over skepticism. For if these structures exist, then there is also a place where they meet. Hide best, below the surface. This is where we head now, guided not by certainties, but by the willingness to look, without haste, and go down where history rarely takes us invites, with attention, courage, and ancient silence that always calls. Descending is an ancient symbolic gesture. Whenever humanity needed to hide something precious, built down. The European underground keeps this logic like an echo persistent. Under streets, churches, and palaces, there is another geography, made up of passages, narrow spaces, silent chambers, and corridors that do not appear on maps. They are not geological accidents. These are human choices, repeated over centuries, sometimes millennia. In many European cities, the official story unfolds above, while the real story, complexity, lies below. Roman catacombs, medieval crypts, defensive tunnels, escape routes, storage galleries, and ritual spaces form successive layers of intention. Each era built on the previous one, not just reusing stone, but inheriting the impulse to hide. There are places where this overlap is so dense that the modern city seems just a cover. In Paris, kilometers of tunnels support the weight of the surface. In Naples, the entire world exists beneath the feet of its inhabitants. In Prague, underground passages connect different eras. These spaces were not made for everyday circulation, were made to preserve, protect, and separate. The underground works like an archive because it is stable. Beneath the earth, time moves different. Fires, wars, and reconstructions rarely reach these depths. By that is, what you want to keep out of. Sight finds refuge there. Not just bodies or objects, but ideas, rituals, knowledge that should not circulate freely. During periods of instability, going down meant surviving. Invasions, Collapses, political and religious persecution pushed entire populations underground. But not every underground is born out of urgency. Many of these spaces were planned with advance, carefully excavated, guided by symbolic and practical principles. There are a clear difference between improvised shelter and deliberate architecture. The most intriguing thing is that this pattern is not limited to a specific period. He crosses the antiquity, the Middle Ages, and modernity, as if each generation recognized intuitively the strategic value of the invisible. What cannot be seen is not easily attacked. Oh, what is hidden buys time. And timing, at critical moments, is everything. Some of these places were sealed intentionally. Closed entrances, access forgotten, maps destroyed. Not by chance, many. Underground discoveries happen by accident. A work, a landslide, a wall that gives way. It's as if the land itself would choose when to reveal what it holds. And when it reveals, it almost always raises uncomfortable questions. Because the underground doesn't just hold ancient remains, it contains contradictions, structures that do not fit into the accepted chronology, tunnels that look older than the cities above them, spaces whose purpose has been erased, but whose execution betrays. Advanced planning. Each hidden corridor is a line outside the official text. There is also a psychological dimension to this downward movement. Going down is confronting the unconscious. It's moving away from the public light and facing what has been repressed. It's no coincidence that so many spiritual traditions associate the underground with initiation, symbolic death, and rebirth. What is sought below is not comfort, it is transformation. When we look at the European underground as a whole, it stops looking chaotic. Surge a conscious repeating pattern. Places chosen, similar techniques, purposes that intersect. It is a fragmented but coherent system, a distributed file, not centralized, protected by forgetfulness and everyday indifference. Perhaps the biggest mistake is to treat these spaces as isolated curiosities. They are chapters of the same underground story, written without fanfare, a story that crosses borders and regimes, surviving because it never depended on recognition. Official. The European underground doesn't want attention, he wants time, and patience to be read. When we accept this, something changes in the way we walk through cities. Every square can hide a calculated void. Each church can rest on a larger space, old and silent. The floor stops being just a support and becomes a witness. A Europe, seen from above, tells a story. View from below tells another completely different. And it is exactly this difference that calls us forward. Because if there is a file under our feet, then there are also potential readers. People willing to go down without hurry, without rigid certainties, just with attention. The European subsoil does not reveal itself to anyone looking for quick answers. He opens up to those who accept the discomfort of not knowing everything. As we progress, it becomes clear that descending is not an end, but a method old, repeated, almost instinctive. What was hidden was not ready to disappear. I was waiting for another look, another time, another collective maturity. The European underground, it is not just preserved past, it's a future on hold. And the deeper we go, the more we realize that the next revelation is not in the heights, but in what has always been right away below, holding everything in silence. It is there that history breathes intact, waiting for those who have the courage to listen before trying to explain the past without rush or fear. Every civilization chooses what to remember, but we rarely talk about what she chooses forget. The extinguishing does not happen abruptly like a visible fire. He is slow, administrative, almost polite. What doesn't fit is classified as irrelevant. What bothers you is called an exception. And what threatens the dominant narrative is, at few, pushed out of the collective field of vision. The history we learn is not false. It is incomplete, built by choices, successive actions made by institutions, empires, academies, and systems of power that needed of continuity, stability, and identity. For a narrative to work, it needs to be simple enough to be taught. And simplicity, almost always, requires cuts. These cuts are rarely confessed. They disguise themselves as scientific method, academic consensus, of lack of sufficient evidence. But the absence of evidence nor always means absence of fact. It often means a lack of interest in look beyond what is permitted. Knowledge, like any territory, has borders, and someone decides where they are. When ancient structures challenge accepted chronologies, the reaction is not usually immediate curiosity. It's usually resistance, forced adjustments, reinterpretations convenient, because admitting that there were advanced civilizations before what we suppose is not only changes dates, it changes the image we have of ourselves, and this is deeply uncomfortable. Erasure also happens through language. Terms such as primitive, ritualistic, or symbolic are used to neutralize the impact of findings that suggest sophistication, technical or intellectual. By calling something symbolic, we remove the need to understand it as functional. By calling it a ritual, we avoid investigating its engineering. There is also erasure due to excess. So much information, so many theories, so many ruins that the essential is diluted. The public gets tired, curiosity fragments, and the silence returns. Modern oblivion need not destroy, it just distracts. Academic institutions are not villains. They are human, and like everything human, operate under pressure. Funding, reputation, tradition. An established paradigm sustains entire careers. Questioning it requires courage and, often, sacrifice. Therefore, truly disruptive ideas are rarely embraced immediately. They are tolerated margin until they become inevitable or are discarded by time. But there is something that not even erasure can completely eliminate: the restlessness, that persistent feeling that something isn't closing, that there are big gaps too much to ignore. It is this restlessness that makes certain questions return generation after generation, even when they are not answered. If something within you is awakening now, stay there until the end of this journey. No for ready-made answers, but because sometimes the answer is not a sentence, it is an alignment internal, a silent recognition that you are looking in the right direction. Erasure also happens within us. We are trained from an early age to trust more in external authorities than in our ability to perceive patterns. We learn to distrust intuition when it is not accompanied by an official seal. But intuition, when matured, is just deep perception, and perception is a form of intelligence. Those who decide what we remember don't just control books, control horizons, sets up to where we can imagine. Therefore, recovering what was forgotten is not an act of rebellion-free. It is a gesture of responsibility, because a humanity that does not know its deep past tends to repeat its breakdowns without understanding why. Perhaps the greatest fear is not discovering that there was something before us, but discovering that that something was wiser than we supposed, who has already faced similar crises, that already fell, who already tried to preserve knowledge for those who came later, and yet was forgotten. Erasure is not the end of the story. It's a forced break, and every pause holds potential of resumption. What was buried returns when it finds minds prepared to deal with its complexity, not to idolize the past, but to learn from it. As these layers of forgetfulness begin to dissolve, an inevitable question: if so much was externally erased, what else was preserved internally? Because memories don't just live in rocks and tunnels. They live in myths, symbols, and archetypes. And perhaps it is there, in this invisible territory, that the next key is waiting to be recognized. When written history fails, the myth remains, not as a naive fantasy, but as memory container. Ancient people knew that not everything could be preserved in stone or parchment. Some truths needed to survive in symbolic form, passing through generations disguised as legend, song, or ritual. Europe, before being political territory, it was mythical territory, and their myths did not appear out of nowhere. Gods who descend to the underground world, heroes who cross caves, kingdoms hidden under mountains, secret passages between worlds. These themes are repeated, insistent on European traditions. Celts, Greeks, Norse, Slavic peoples, cultures separated in space but connected by similar images. The underground as a place of proof, knowledge, and transformation, not as punishment, but as initiation. Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious, a psychic reservoir where fundamental human experiences remain alive, even when forgotten consciously. Archetypes are not born out of nowhere. They form when certain events or structures repeat themselves with enough force to mark the human psyche. The myth, in this sense, not invention. He remembers. When legends speak of hidden cities, of ancient people who descended after cataclysms, of wisdom kept far from the surface, may not be describing literal facts, but they may be pointing to realities experienced and then reinterpreted. Human memory rarely preserves technical details. It preserves meaning. Mythical Europe is full of entrances, cracks in the earth, sacred caves, wells without background, places where the visible world meets the invisible. These points were respected, feared, and protected. They were not common spaces. They were thresholds. Cross them it required preparation, silence, and intention, as if the knowledge stored there could not be accessed carelessly. As the centuries passed, these stories were emptied of their context, original, transformed into folklore, entertainment, or superstition. But something in them resisted, a sense that the underground was not just geographic, but psychological. Descend it meant confronting the unknown within. Returning meant integration. Modern science tends to separate myth and reality, but perhaps this separation is too recent to account for the deep past. Ancient people did not compartmentalize my experience same way. For them, engineering, spirituality, and symbolism coexisted. A structure could be functional and sacred at the same time. A tunnel could serve physical survival and inner transformation. This explains why so many underground spaces show signs of ritualization, brands, alignments, peculiar acoustics. They weren't just hiding places. They were environments prepared for specific states of consciousness. The silence, the darkness, the reverb, all of this alters perception, and perception shapes meaning. Ancestral memory is not interested in exact chronologies. She moves through images, and the images that persist point to real, repeated experiences. Remarkable. The descent, the crossing, the return. This cycle appears in myths because it appeared in life. When we ignore the myths, we miss an essential layer of understanding. No, because we must take them literally, but because they offer emotional and symbolic clues about how the past was lived. They are internal maps of external experiences. Perhaps the biggest mistake is to treat myth as opposition to reason, when in fact he is complement. Where technical language does not reach, metaphor acts. Where the data is loses, the symbol remains. And together they build a more complete memory. When we look at European myths in light of hidden structures, something clicks. What it seemed like fantasy gains context. What seemed like exaggeration reveals prudence. Maybe right truths needed to be veiled to survive. Not out of weakness, but out of protection. These spiritual echoes do not require blind belief. They demand listening. A listening that does not seek immediate proofs, but profound coherence. When different cultures tell stories, similar, something common runs through them. And that something is rarely an isolated invention. Ancestral memory does not scream. She whispers. And whispers through symbols that resist to time better than dates. When we learn to listen to these whispers, the past, it stops being strange. It becomes intimate. And in that silent recognition, we realize that underground Europe not only holds physical structures, but reflections of itself human journey, repeated countless times, waiting to be understood again with maturity, respect, and attention. There is a moment in this journey when Europe stops being a place and becomes a reflection. The hidden structures, the forgotten tunnels, the cities beneath cities begin to fall apart, point to something beyond archaeology. They reveal a deeply human pattern, because what we bury outside almost always reflects what we bury inside. The human soul is also stratified. Layers of experiences, traumas, wisdom, and forgetfulness accumulates over time. What we can't integrate, we consciously push down. We do not destroy, we just hide it. So what civilizations do with their past when it becomes too complex to sustain the present identity? Europe, with its dense and silent subsoil, mirrors this process, precisely unsettling. Organized surfaces, linear narratives, visible progress. And below that, tortuous passages, interrupted stories, truths that did not disappear. Just they await sufficient maturity to be revisited without fear. Every culture builds an image of itself, but this picture is never complete. She needs to omit conflicts, failures, and falls to maintain cohesion. The problem arises when the that is omitted becomes too large, when the shadow grows. Jung already warned that what is not brought to consciousness returns as destiny. Perhaps this is what the hidden structures tell us, that Europe, as well as being human, went through profound collapses, that fell, forgot, rebuilt, and moved on, carrying invisible marks. And that these brands continue to operate even when ignored. There is something therapeutic about acknowledging this, because it removes the weight of perfection from history and returns humanity to its legitimate complexity. We are not a straight line of progress. We are a cycle of trials, errors, learning, and restarts. Ancient civilizations did not. They failed due to ignorance, but due to an excess of challenge. Some may have gone far too much too soon. Others were interrupted by forces they had no control over. When we look at Europe this way, judgment gives way to empathy. The ruins, they cease to be evidence of delay and become testimony of courage. Build, fall, and yet trying to preserve something for the future is a deeply human gesture. Even when it fails, it carries intent. The mirror becomes clearer when we realize that historical erasure is repeated in the individual. How many parts of us have been silenced because they didn't fit in? How many experiences were pushed to the back of memory so that we could follow working? Just as cities were built upon cities, personalities are built on previous versions of ourselves. And just like in the underground Europes, these versions don't disappear. They remain accessible, influential, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. Don't stop dominate, but to integrate. True maturity, individual or collective, does not come from denial of the past, but of the ability to dialogue with it. Europe as a mirror invites us to stop looking for blame and start looking understanding. It's not about glorifying lost civilizations, but about learning from their cycles. It is important to understand that progress without integration generates collapse. What knowledge without wisdom creates imbalance, and that forgetting who we were weakens who we try to be. There is a point where archaeology and psychology meet, where digging the earth becomes metaphor for excavating consciousness. The method is the same: care, patience, respect for what emerges. Forcing revelations destroys as much as ignoring them. Maybe that's why these structures are coming to light now. Not just because we have technology to discover them, but because we have the maturity to support their implications. What once threatened rigid identities can now be integrated into a more broad spectrum of humanity. When Europe is seen as a mirror, it gives us a silent question. What did you do with your own past? What was buried out of necessity and what was buried out of fear? Because just like continents, individuals also arrive at a point at which they need to consciously descend so as not to be governed by what ignore. This recognition does not weaken. He frees, allows you to walk on the surface with lighter, knowing that what is below is not the enemy. It's part. And when this integration begins, something is getting ready to change. Because understanding the mirror is the step prior to synthesis. And synthesis is always the threshold of a deeper silent revelation and transformative which does not come from outside, but emerges when we are ready to unite all layers into a single living consciousness. We reach a point where the pieces start to touch, not like a solved puzzle, but like a field of meaning that is organized. Hidden structures, persistent myths, and institutional silence converge into a same intuition. None of this exists in isolation. Everything points to a deeper, more complex, and more conscious human past than we admit. Synthesis is not a new theory, it is an internal repositioning. When we accept that history has layers, we stop demanding single answers. We begin to perceive patterns, rhythms, and repetitions that cross cultures and eras. This perception does not take away the ground. It broadens the horizon. Europe, seen from this angle, reveals a silent pedagogy. She teaches that knowledge needs time to mature and silence to survive. Civilizations that tried to speed up too much paid a heavy price. Those who learned to hide, code, and transmit symbolically left traces lasting. The underground, physical and psychic, emerges as a strategy of continuity. It's not escape, it's preservation. By integrating science, myth, and spirituality, something balances. Science offers method, myth offers meaning, spirituality offers direction. Separated, they become poor. Together, They clarify. This synthesis does not ask for belief, it asks for responsibility. Responsibility to look without reducing, to investigate without ridiculing, to remember without idolize. When we do this, the past stops being a threat and becomes a resource to overcome current crises with more lucidity. Maybe that's why so many discoveries are emerging now. Not because they are new, but because we are ready to hear them. Spiritual synthesis does not point to final answers. She points to a posture, humble, open, and deeply attentive. A posture capable of walking over ruins without despising them, and advances without absolutize them. In this state, the past does not matter. He guides. Underground Europe, then, stops being an isolated mystery and becomes an integrated mirror that reflects our relationship with time, with oblivion, and with the sacred. When you recognize this, something quiets down. The search stops being frantic and becomes contemplative. We no longer rush to dig up everything. We learn to wait for the right moment for each revelation. This maturity is the true threshold. Without it, knowledge becomes a burden. With it, it becomes a path. We are therefore ready to close, not as a rigid conclusion, but as a final breath before silence. Because every true synthesis does not conclude, it prepares the spirit to hear what comes next. And what comes after is rarely noise. It's a gentle calling, an invitation that does not force, only attracts. When we arrived here, we realized that getting down was only half the gesture. The other half is returning carefully. Return to the surface without denying what we saw. Carry with us the awareness that nothing essential is lost. Just wait. Wait for the right time, for an open mind, for an available heart. This is the synthesis that and offers now, not as an absolute truth, but as a living possibility. A possibility that is completed in the next step, because every real path calls for closure and continuation. And that's exactly where we find ourselves, at the point where silence becomes a message and listening becomes movement. What remains is to trust the final step. It will be given gently, and maybe, just maybe, with a new beginning hidden within the end. Breathe, listen, remain attentive. Maybe what we call the end is just the point where silence begins to speak. After going down, looking and remembering, something in us asks for pause, not to end the search, but to honor it. Because every true revelation requires stillness. It is in this space that history stops being an object and becomes a living experience. What is hidden beneath Europe does not want to be conquered. He wants to be respected. He doesn't want constant spotlight, but awareness. These structures, tunnels, and memories do not call for immediate belief. They ask for maturity. They ask us to walk with more questions than certainties. And that, today, is already a form of wisdom. When we leave this path, we do not have ready-made answers. We take another way of looking. The ground we walk on is never just ground again. He becomes a witness. Each city now has depth. Each ruin gains dignity. And each silence begins to say something that previously went unnoticed. Perhaps the greatest transformation is not in the past that we rediscover, but in the present, which we reformulated. By accepting that history has layers, we learn to live more compassionately. We understand falls, failures, and new beginnings. We realize that we are neither late nor early. We are in process, as we always have been. True closure is not forgetting what we saw, but integrating. Allow knowledge to descend from the mind to the body. May it influence choices, rhythms, and expectations. May it make us less anxious for absolute truths and more attentive to subtle signs. Because the essential rarely screams. He whispers. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Not as someone who collects content, but as someone who continues a journey. The deep story does not reveal itself all at once. It gets closer as the eye, listening, matures. There is no rush to understand everything. Some truths reveal themselves in layers like the earth itself. Today, you only played one of them. Others will remain silent, slowly working within. They manifest themselves in dreams, unexpected questions, subtle changes in gaze. None of this is by chance. It's assimilation. When consciousness encounters something greater, it needs time to reorganize the world around. Therefore, allow this content to breathe within you. May it walk, together, effortlessly. The path does not require immediate adherence, just continued presence. And presence, when it is real, transforms. It deepens with daily attention and conscious choices made in silent everyday life. Thus, learning becomes lived, not just understood. This changes everything little by little. No fuss, no pressure, with truth and quiet courage to move forward with confidence and be careful, constant, interior. In the end, there remains one question that does not need to be answered now, just felt. What if what we call the past is just waiting for us to become conscious enough to remember it without fear? What if what we call a cult is actually an invitation? An invitation to walk with more humility, more presence, and more silence. Because perhaps what we call the end is just the beginning of a memory that soul has not yet forgotten.